Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Facebook Live Bible Study, Week 13. Last week, we introduced Joshua. We talked about who Joshua was, we talked about the Israelites crossing the land, and the Israelites taking the land. We also introduced the book of Romans, and we discussed themes that were presented in the first half, and what Paul says to the people of Romans. This week, we're going to conclude Joshua by discussing the division of the land and how the Israelites were instructed to serve the Lord in that land. We'll also conclude Romans by discussing God's righteousness to Israel and to the Gentiles, God's righteousness in everyday life, the extension of God's righteousness through the Pauline mission, and the final summary of the gospel of the righteousness of God. Today, we're going to be discussing the second half of the book of Joshua. The second part of this book primarily focuses on the division of the land and serving God in the land. Dividing the land. This third major section in Joshua begins with an initiative. The Lord instructs Joshua regarding the division and allocation of the land. Israel has gained the upper hand, yet there remains land to process, and Israel has yet to defeat many enemies. But the Lord pledges to continue to drive Israel's enemies out and instructs Joshua to go ahead and allot the lands. During the conquest of Canaan, Joshua allotted the lands to the tribes of Israel. These boundaries, however, do not necessarily reflect the land each tribe actually inhabited. Chapter 14 describes the tribal allocation west of the Jordan. It begins and ends almost identically, making a reference to Eleazar the priest, Joshua, and the heads of the father houses of the Israelite tribes. The major part of this section revolves around the assembly of the whole congregation of the people of Israel at Shiloh, before the tent of meeting. Here, a main idea is presented that those who follow the Lord will be able to enjoy their inheritance. The designation of the 6 cities of refuge show the Lord's concern that the land not only be allocated as an inheritance, but that it be a land where justice prevails and true worship is cultivated. This section ends with a proclamation that the Lord has fulfilled all the promises he has made to the house of Israel. Serving the Lord in the land. Now, in this section, the eastern tribes of Reuben, Gad, and eastern Manasseh are released to return to their homes, having fulfilled their duties to their fellow Israelites west of the Jordan. The key word serve occurs 3 times, and Joshua charges the eastern tribes to serve the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul. Joshua, in old age, charges the next generation of leaders, reminiscent of Joshua's own charge. At the end of his life, Joshua is called a servant of the Lord and is credited with a lifespan of 110 years. Now, let's move on to the second half of the book of Romans. The first section in the second half of the book of Romans is God's righteousness to Israel and to the Gentiles. Now, in this section, Paul makes it clear that God's saving promises have been fulfilled for the Gentiles. The Church of Jesus Christ now enjoys the spiritual blessings promised to Israel: the gift of the Spirit, adoption as God's children, future glory, election, and the promise of never being severed from God's love. Paul asks whether the promises God has made to Israel be fulfilled. If his promises to the Jews remain unfulfilled, how can Gentile Christians be sure that he will fulfill the great promises? Paul answers that God is faithful to his saving promises to Israel, and that he will ultimately save his people. God's saving promises to Israel are irrevocable since they depend upon his word of promise and his grace. God's sovereignty is compatible with human responsibility. Israel should have believed the gospel and trusted in Christ, but the majority refused to do so. Still, God's saving promises will be fulfilled, and God's saving righteousness is featured in the salvation of Israel at the end of history, and in his saving plan for both Jews and Gentiles. Now, as Paul concludes this section, he breaks into praise. That brings us to the second section of the second half of the book of Romans, God's righteousness in everyday life. Here, Paul instructs that Christians are to give themselves entirely to God because of his saving grace. Paul uses sacrificial language from the Old Testament to denote the new life of Christians, for both body and soul belong to God. They are a living sacrifice. However, the present evil age still threatens those who belong to Christ, so they must resist its pressures. Their lives are changed as their minds are made new so that they are able to discern God's will. Paul calls upon each to assess themselves realistically, and he tells Christians that they should concentrate upon and give their energies to the gifts God has given them. Paul addresses a specific dispute over whether Christians need to abide by Jewish food laws. Paul clearly sides theologically with the strong, but he encourages them not to despise nor scandalize the weak. The third point made in the second half of the book of Romans is the extension of God's righteousness through the Pauline mission. Now here Paul focuses on his calling as the apostle to the Gentiles, adding some greetings and final instructions. Paul explains his unique ministry to the Gentiles and exhorts the Roman Church to be a sending base for his mission to Spain. Paul's aim was to preach the gospel in areas where no churches existed. His calling was not to plant churches where they already existed. Paul greets those that he knows in Rome who are involved in the ministry, showing the love that existed among Christians. Now these greetings support the authenticity of the Pauline gospel. The final summary of the gospel of righteousness of God. Many of the themes in the beginning of the book of Romans reappear in the conclusion. Paul comes to the main point of the letter by saying that the God who has planned salvation history in this way is all-wise and deserves glory forevermore. That concludes both Joshua and Romans. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, we ask that you post them and that we can grow together in Christ by addressing them. Thank you.